The wind howled, a lonely ghost rattling the dry bones of the Thorne family ranch. Elias Thorne reined in his weary horse, a bay mare named Sadie, and stared at the sight before him. It was a ruin, not from fire or flood, but from neglect. Years of it. The porch sagged like a broken spine, the picket fence was a collection of splintered teeth, and a thick layer of dust coated everything, a silent blanket over a forgotten life. Elias had left this place 7 years ago, a boy of 18 with a fire in his belly and a sense of duty burning brighter than the morning sun. He had gone to fight in the war, a war that had torn the country in two. He had seen things no man should ever see, felt things no man should ever feel. The battlefield had stolen his youth and replaced it with a grim wisdom that sat heavy in his eyes. Now, as he dismounted, the silence of the ranch was louder than any cannon he had ever heard. It was the sound of what he had lost. He tethered Sadie to a post that miraculously still stood and walked toward the small log cabin. The door, off its hinges, groaned in protest as he pushed it open. A cloud of dust billowed out, catching the afternoon sun in a million dancing specks. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of decay and memory. Elias's hand instinctively went to the pistol on his hip. Habit, years of living on edge, always expecting an ambush. He moved through the one-room cabin, his boots crunching on dry leaves that had blown in through the gaps in the walls. The stone fireplace was a cold tomb. The simple cot where his parents had slept was covered in a dusty sheet, a ghostly effigy of their past. A single photograph sat on a small wobbly table, his mother and father, their faces worn but smiling. A pang of regret, sharp and cold, hit him in the chest. They had been gone for years, victims of a fever that had swept through the territory. He had missed their funeral, too busy fighting for a cause that felt so distant now. Elias walked back outside, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples. He had to get to work. The ranch wouldn't fix itself. He started with the barn, a slightly more solid structure. Inside, the stalls were empty, the hay brittle and gray. He found an old broom and began to sweep away the years of grime. The rhythmic swish-swish of the bristles was a small comfort, a familiar sound in a sea of foreign silence. Hours bled into one another. He mended a broken stall door, patched a leak in the roof, and as darkness fell, managed to get a small fire going in the cabin's fireplace. He cooked a simple meal of salted pork and hardtack and ate it in silence, the crackle of the fire his only companion. The solitude, which he had come to expect, was a heavy cloak. He was used to being alone. The war had taught him that the only person you could truly rely on was yourself. He unrolled his bedroll on the dusty floor and lay down, staring at the ceiling. The moon peeked through a crack, casting a silvery beam on the opposite wall. The sounds of the night, a coyote's distant howl, the rustle of leaves in the wind, were a lullaby of the wild, but sleep refused to come. His mind was a battlefield of its own, replaying fragments of memories, flashes of violence, and the faces of men he had known and lost. He was home, but he was not at peace. The quiet of the ranch was an empty canvas, and all he had to paint on it were the shadows of his past. Elias finally drifted off, a restless sleep punctuated by dreams of gunpowder and screams. He woke before dawn, the chill of the morning air biting at his skin. He saddled Sadie and rode out to inspect the fences, a task he knew would take weeks. As he rode, he saw the land not just as dirt and rock, but as a testament to his family's hard work, a legacy that was now his to save. He pushed himself, fueled by a stubborn resolve to bring this place back to life. It was all he had left. Days turned into a week. He worked from sunup to sundown, his hands calloused and his muscles aching. He rode into the nearest town, Harmony Creek, for supplies. The town was a dusty collection of wooden buildings, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith. The locals eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He was a stranger with a familiar last name. Old Man Hemlock, the store owner, remembered his father. "Elias Thorne's boy, ain't you?" he grunted, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thought you was dead." Elias simply nodded, paid for his goods, and left. He wasn't looking for friends. He was looking for a fresh start, and that required solitude. As he neared the ranch on his way back, the sun was setting once more. A flicker of movement caught his eye near the cabin, a shadow, not his own. He stopped, his hand on his pistol. He dismounted quietly, his boots making no sound on the dry earth. He approached the cabin from the side, staying low, his senses on high alert. He peered through the broken window. What he saw inside made his heart stop. A figure was huddled by the cold fireplace. Not a bandit, not a squatter. A woman, a young woman, her long black hair matted with dirt and blood. She was shivering, her face pale, a deep gash on her arm. She was Native American, a fact that tightened the knot in his stomach. The war had taught him to be wary of everyone, and the conflict with the tribes had been especially brutal. Yet, seeing her like this, so vulnerable, so clearly in need, something shifted inside him. It wasn't the kind of enemy he had been trained to fight. It was a human being in pain. A sense of duty, a different kind this time, took hold of him. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a man with a ranch, and this was his land. He had a choice to make. He took a deep breath, holstered his pistol, and pushed the door open, the old wood groaning in a familiar protest. The sound of the door creaking open made her jump. Ayana's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear, and she let out a small, pained gasp. She was a ghost of a girl, her face gaunt, her skin pale beneath a layer of dirt. Her buckskin tunic was torn and stained with blood, and her long black hair was a tangled mess. She pressed herself against the cold stone of the fireplace, a hunted animal trapped in a den that wasn't hers. Elias stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the fading light. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the hard lines of a soldier carved into his face. His eyes, dark and intense, held a mix of caution and something else she couldn't name. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his gaze sweeping from her matted hair to the gash on her forearm, from which a thin trail of blood had dried. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Finally, Elias moved. He stepped inside, letting the door fall shut behind him. The sound was like a gunshot in the still room. Ayana flinched, her body tensing, ready to fight or to run, even though she knew she could do neither. He held up his hands, a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't friendly, but it wasn't threatening either. It was simply a statement of fact. He took a few slow steps toward her, and she instinctively shrank back. "I'm Elias," he said, his eyes on her. "This is my home." She didn't respond, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was a vision of fear and exhaustion. Elias saw the way her hand trembled as she clutched her arm. He saw the pain in her eyes, the kind that went deeper than a physical wound. It was the look of someone who had lost everything. He walked to the back of the cabin, knelt down by his supplies, and pulled out a clean strip of cloth and a small flask of whiskey. He didn't know what to do. His instincts screamed for him to be cautious, to send her away. But a different part of him, a part he didn't recognize, urged him to help. He had seen too much death, too much suffering. He couldn't just leave her here to die. He walked back to her and held out the supplies. "This'll help," he said, his voice a little softer this time. She eyed the items with suspicion, her gaze flickering from the cloth to his face. "Go on," he urged. Ayana hesitated, then slowly, tentatively reached out and took the cloth and flask. Her fingers were cold and trembling. Elias knelt down a few feet away from her, giving her space. He watched as she uncorked the flask, and a grimace of pain crossed her face as she poured the stinging liquid over the wound. She then began to wrap the cloth tightly around her arm. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if every ounce of her energy was dedicated to this simple task. She didn't make a sound, but Elias could see the effort in her face. The silence was broken only by her ragged breathing and the crackle of the fire he had lit earlier. Once she was done, she slumped back against the stone, her eyes closed in exhaustion. She was clearly barely clinging to life. Elias stood up and walked to his cot. He pulled the dusty sheet off and folded it neatly. "You can use this," he said, dropping it on the floor a few feet from the fire. She didn't open her eyes, but she nodded her head in thanks. He then took his own blanket and bedroll and settled down on the opposite side of the room, a clear signal that he wasn't a threat. He was a protector, not a predator. He watched her for a long time as she drifted into a fitful sleep. Her breathing was shallow, punctuated by soft whimpers. She was having nightmares, haunted by whatever had happened to her. Elias felt a stir of something he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of human connection, a small flame of compassion in the cold, dark cave of his heart. The war had hardened him, but it hadn't completely extinguished the man he used to be, the man who had a family, a home, a life. He woke up with the first light of dawn. The cabin was cold and silent. He sat up, his body aching, and looked over to where she had been. She was gone. Panic, a cold, sharp feeling shot through him. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing his pistol. Had she left? Had she been taken? He ran outside, scanning the horizon. Nothing. He checked the barn. Nothing. He returned to the cabin, his mind racing. Then he saw it, a faint trail of small, bare footprints leading from the cabin door to the river that ran behind his property. He followed the trail, his heart pounding in his chest. As he neared the river, he heard a sound, the soft splash of water. He moved quietly, peeking through the thicket of trees. Ayana was kneeling at the water's edge, her hands cupped, drinking. She was still a picture of fragile exhaustion, but the water seemed to be giving her a small measure of life. As she finished drinking, she began to wash the dirt and grime from her face, revealing a delicate bone structure and high cheekbones. Her eyes, he noticed, were a deep, intelligent brown, full of an ancient sadness. She finished and stood up, her body swaying slightly. She was even smaller than he had thought, a wisp of a woman against the vastness of the land. She turned, her eyes meeting his. She didn't flinch this time. She just looked at him, a silent question in her gaze. He walked out of the trees, a basket of berries he had gathered the day before in his hand. He knelt down and offered them to her. "You need to eat," he said. Ayana looked at the berries, then at him, a new look of tentative trust in her eyes. She reached out and took one, a small red berry, and put it in her mouth. A faint smile touched her lips, and for the first time, Elias saw a flicker of the girl she must have been before her world was shattered. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking sight. He sat down a few feet away, watching her as she ate the berries, the two of them a small, silent tableau against the vast, indifferent landscape. The silence was different this time. It wasn't empty. It was the quiet of two lost souls, finding a strange, temporary solace in each other's company. For the next few days, their cohabitation was a dance of polite distance. Ayana remained quiet, a shadow moving through Elias's home. She spent her days by the river, washing the caked dirt from her clothes and hair, her every movement an act of silent resilience. Elias, for his part, continued his work on the ranch, mending fences and clearing brush, always with a watchful eye on her. He didn't ask her questions, and she offered no answers. Their communication was a series of small, unspoken gestures. He would leave food for her on the porch, dried meat, berries, and fresh water, and she would take it, leaving the empty bowl in its place. It was an understanding built on respect and a shared need for space. Elias's curiosity, however, gnawed at him. He wondered what had happened to her, what horrors she had witnessed. The gash on her arm was a constant reminder. One evening, as the sun cast long shadows across the valley, he found her sitting on the porch, her gaze fixed on the setting sun. Her expression was one of profound sadness, a kind of grief that was too vast for tears. He sat down beside her, a respectable distance between them. "Where are you from?" he asked, his voice low. Ayana didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the horizon. "My people. They are gone," she said, her voice a soft, melodic whisper, her English surprisingly clear, though accented. "Gone with the wind." Elias's heart sank. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. He knew the feeling of being the last one left. He knew the silence that follows a great loss. She finally turned her head to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "The white men, they came in the night," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Fire and guns. My father, he told me to run. He told me not to look back. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. I am all that is left. Elias looked away, his own memories of war and loss swirling in his mind. He had been on the other side of that. He had seen the devastation of conflict, but he had never been the one to cause it. He had always been a soldier following orders, a boy trying to survive. But now, in the face of her pain, he felt a crushing weight of shared guilt. He reached for his canteen and offered it to her. She took it, her hand still trembling, and drank. The gesture was small, but it was a bridge between them. My family. They're gone too, he said, his voice barely audible. Fever took them. I was away, at war. Ayana's eyes softened with understanding. We are two broken things, she said quietly, lost in this world. Maybe not so lost, he murmured, more to himself than to her. He didn't know why he said it. He didn't believe it. But looking at her, a strange sense of responsibility was taking root in his heart. She wasn't just a stranger he had found. She was a fellow survivor, a kindred spirit in the vast, unforgiving emptiness. Over the next few days, their conversation, once a trickle, became a quiet stream. They didn't talk about their pasts, but they talked about the present. Elias learned her name, Ayana, which meant eternal blossom. She learned his and the history of the land he was trying to reclaim. She was knowledgeable about the land in a way he never could be. She knew which plants were good for medicine, which berries were edible, and where to find the best fishing spots in the river. She pointed out things he had never noticed, the flight of a rare bird, the tracks of a cougar, the way the wind whispered a different story through the canyon walls. One afternoon, as he was struggling to fix a stubborn fence post, she approached him, a small bundle of herbs in her hand. This will help, she said, her voice soft. For your hands. She unwrapped the bundle, revealing a poultice of crushed leaves. He had a deep gash on his palm from a rusty nail. She knelt down, her fingers gentle and surprisingly strong, as she applied the poultice and wrapped it with a strip of cloth she had torn from her own tunic. The touch of her hands was a shock to him, a jolt of human warmth he hadn't felt in years. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Her face was still gaunt, but her eyes held a spark of life. Thank you, he said, his voice a little hoarse. It is nothing, she said simply. The act of kindness broke a dam within him. He was no longer just a rancher, and she was no longer just a refugee. They were two people, helping each other, healing each other in small, meaningful ways. He began to see her not as an obligation, but as a part of his life, a strange and unexpected reward in his lonely existence. He found himself looking forward to her quiet company at the end of the day, to the small smile that would touch her lips when he brought back a fish from the river or a particularly sweet apple from a wild tree. He was still a solitary man, but he was no longer alone. The ranch, once a monument to his solitude, was slowly becoming a home. It wasn't the home of his childhood, but something new, something different. Something they were building together, brick by painstaking brick, silently and with no promises. It was a fragile thing, this newfound companionship, but it was real, and in a world filled with betrayal and violence, its authenticity was a profound comfort. The peace that had settled over the ranch was as fragile as a spider's web. Elias knew it couldn't last. The world outside their small bubble was a dangerous place, and they were in a vulnerable position. The nearest town, Harmony Creek, was a microcosm of the wider world, full of men who saw Native Americans as nothing more than savages, obstacles to be removed. He was a white man living with a native woman, a truth that would not be tolerated by many. One afternoon, as Elias was repairing the corral fence, he saw a rider approaching in the distance. His hand instinctively went to his pistol. He squinted, trying to make out the figure. It was a single man riding a powerful-looking horse, his silhouette framed by the setting sun. Elias knew the man. It was Jebediah Stone, the owner of the general store in Harmony Creek. He was a gruff man, but generally harmless. However, the look on his face as he got closer was anything but friendly. Ayana, who had been tending to a small garden she had started, saw him too. Her body tensed, her gaze fixed on the approaching figure. She took a step back, melting into the shadows of the cabin's porch. Fear, sharp and cold, returned to her eyes. "Elias Thorne!" Jebediah called out, his voice a gravelly roar. "Didn't expect to see you back here, boy. Heard you was living out here all alone." Elias walked to the edge of the corral, his posture relaxed but his muscles coiled, ready for anything. "Just trying to fix the place up, Jebediah," he said, his voice even. "What can I do for you?" Jebediah's eyes, a shrewd, calculating blue, scanned the property. They landed on the porch, where Ayanna was now a barely perceptible shadow. He didn't need to see her clearly to know what she was. The long black hair, the buckskin tunic, the fear in her posture. It was all he needed. A cruel, knowing smirk spread across his face. "Heard some rumors," Jebediah said, his voice dropping to a low sneer. "'Bout you taking in some kind of stray. Didn't believe it, but I see with my own eyes." He let the sentence hang in the air, his gaze flicking back and forth between Elias and the porch. Elias's jaw tightened. "She's just a traveler in need of help, Jebediah. Nothing more." "Traveler?" Jebediah scoffed, a dark laugh rumbling in his chest. "That's a squaw, Elias. You know what folks in town think about that. She's trouble. Mark my words. You're bringing trouble to your own doorstep." The words were like a physical blow. Elias felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp. "This is my property, Jebediah, and who I choose to help is my business, not yours, not anyone's." Jebediah's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, hard look. "The town ain't gonna like it, Elias. We've had a lot of trouble with the Redskins lately. A lot of folks lost their families. They ain't gonna be happy to hear you're harboring one of them." He spat on the ground, a final, disrespectful gesture. "Don't say I didn't warn you, boy. You're playing with fire." With that, Jebediah turned his horse and rode off, the sound of his hooves a receding echo in the quiet afternoon. Elias stood there, his hands clenched into fists, a cold dread seeping into his heart. He had known this was coming. He had just hoped he had more time. He walked to the porch where Ayanna had emerged from the shadows. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a terror that went beyond just the man who had just left. It was the fear of a lifetime of persecution, a deep-seated dread of the prejudice that had taken her family and her home. He will tell the others," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They will come for me." Elias shook his head, his face a grim mask. "I won't let them," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "I won't let anyone hurt you, Ayanna. I promised myself I wouldn't leave anyone behind again." He led her inside the cabin and sat her down by the fire. "We'll be ready for them," he said. But even as he spoke the words, he knew how futile they sounded. He was just one man, and the hate of a whole town was a force of nature. He grabbed his rifle and began to clean it, his mind racing. He had to be smart about this. He couldn't just stand and fight. He needed a plan. He looked at Ayanna, a small, fragile woman who had already endured more than anyone should have to. She was his responsibility now. He had chosen to save her, and in doing so he had placed a target on his own back. He didn't regret it. Not for a second. The loneliness that had consumed him for so long had been replaced by a purpose, a reason to fight. He wasn't just defending his land, he was defending her. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like a reward worth fighting for. He spent the rest of the day and night fortifying the cabin. He boarded up the broken windows, reinforced the door and set up a watchpost on the roof. He taught Ayanna how to load his pistol, how to handle the rifle. She was a quick study, her hands steady, her eyes focused. "I have handled a bow and arrow since I was a child," she said, a small sad smile on her lips. "This is different, but the goal is the same." They ate their dinner in silence, the tension in the room thick and heavy. The night was cold, the silence punctuated only by the mournful howl of a distant coyote. Elias sat by the fire, his rifle resting on his lap, his gaze fixed on the door. He was a soldier again, but this time he was fighting for a different kind of peace, a peace he had to earn, a peace he had to defend. And as he watched Ayanna drift into a fitful sleep, her face a picture of weary resignation, he knew he would give everything he had to protect her. The lonely rancher had returned home. And in finding his unexpected reward, he had also found a fight worth fighting. The threat of an attack hung in the air like a storm cloud. Elias and Ayana fell into a grim routine of preparation. They spent their days reinforcing the cabin and their nights on edge, listening for any sound that might signal the approach of trouble. The small, silent companionship they had built was now infused with a shared sense of urgency and danger. One morning, as Elias was checking the traps he had set, he saw a familiar figure riding toward the ranch. It wasn't Jebediah Stone. This man was different. He was old, with a grizzled beard and a kindly, weathered face. It was Silas, the blacksmith from Harmony Creek. Silas was a man of few words, but he was known for his quiet wisdom and his fairness. He was one of the few men in town who had never looked at Elias with suspicion. Silas dismounted at the edge of the property, his eyes scanning the new fortifications. He looked at Elias, his gaze steady and serious. "Heard Jebediah was out here," he said, his voice a low, raspy sound. "Said you had a visitor." Elias's hand rested on his pistol. "She's not a visitor, Silas. She's a survivor, and she's under my protection." Silas nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "I figured as much. You're a good man, Elias Thorne. Your pa would be proud." He took a deep breath. "Jebediah's been stirring up a hornet's nest in town. Says you're consorting with the enemy. A few of the men, the ones who lost folks in the last raid, they're angry. They're talking about riding out here." Elias's jaw tightened. "Let them come. They'll find I'm not a man to be trifled with." "I know that," Silas said, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "But you can't fight a mob alone. Not forever. That kind of hate. It's a poison. It'll get to you eventually." He looked at the cabin, and for the first time his gaze softened with a hint of compassion. "The girl. She's been through enough." Ayana, who had been watching from the cabin's window, now stood in the doorway, her hands clasped together, her face a mask of weary resignation. She was a beautiful, haunting figure. Silas's eyes met hers, and something in his expression shifted. He saw not a savage, but a scared young woman. "She's scared, Silas," Elias said, his voice low. "And she has every right to be." Silas looked back at Elias. "I'm not here to start a fight, Elias. I'm here to offer a hand." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a heavy coil of rope and a small sack of nails. "Figured you could use these. A man's home is his castle, and a castle needs its defenses." Elias was surprised. He hadn't expected help. He had expected condemnation. He took the supplies, the weight of the rope a comforting, solid presence in his hands. "Thank you, Silas." I appreciate it." "Don't thank me," Silas grunted. "Just be careful. Jebediah's not the only one. There are others. They're mean-spirited men with nothing but hate in their hearts. They'll use any excuse to cause trouble." He turned to Ayana, a small, sad smile on his lips. "Don't you worry, little one. Not everyone is filled with hate. There are still some of us who believe in a fair shake." He gave a final nod and rode off, disappearing into the dust. The encounter, while brief, had a profound effect on both Elias and Ayana. It was a glimmer of hope in a sea of darkness. There were people out there who saw them not as a threat, but as two human beings in need of a sanctuary. The knowledge that they were not entirely alone in this fight was a powerful, comforting feeling. Elias spent the rest of the day using Silas's supplies to reinforce the cabin even more. Ayana worked by his side, her movements confident and capable. She pointed out weak spots in the walls, suggesting where to place the planks for maximum support. She was more than just a presence in his home. She was a partner. That evening, as they ate their dinner by the fire, the silence between them was different. It was no longer a silence born of distance and fear, but a quiet camaraderie. They had a shared secret, a shared goal. They were a team. "Not all of them are like that," Ayana said, her voice soft. She was referring to Jebediah. "My grandmother, she told me stories of the good white men, men who traded fairly, men who helped us when we were sick. They were few, but they were there." "Same on my side," Elias said, looking at her, a small, genuine smile on his face. "There are good people out there. You just have to find them." He felt a deep, abiding sense of peace as he looked at her. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of his own resilience, his own stubborn will to survive. They were two sides of the same coin, forged in the fires of conflict and loss. Their pasts were different, but their present was a shared one. The lonely rancher had returned home to find a lonely girl, and in their shared solitude, they had found something to hold on to, something to fight for. The real fight was still to come, but they were ready. They were no longer two broken things, lost in the world. They were two whole halves standing together, an unlikely alliance against the coming storm. The following week passed in a state of high alert. Every dust cloud on the horizon was a potential threat, every distant hoofbeat a harbinger of doom. Elias and Ayanna refined their defense plans, their movements a synchronized dance of preparation. Elias taught Ayanna how to aim and fire the rifle with precision, and she, in turn, showed him how to set simple but effective snares and traps around the perimeter of the ranch. Their shared knowledge and trust grew with every passing day, a silent testament to their bond. One evening, as a cold front rolled in, bringing with it a biting wind and the promise of rain, Ayanna approached Elias with a worried look on her face. "The air feels heavy," she said, her voice a low murmur. "Not just the wind. There is a storm coming. Of men." Elias looked at her, his expression grim. "I know," he said, his voice flat. He had felt it too. The tension in Harmony Creek had been palpable on his last trip for supplies. Men had eyed him with open hostility, their whispers following him down the street. It was only a matter of time. "We cannot fight them all," Ayanna said, a note of fear in her voice. "There will be too many." "We'll do what we can," Elias said, his resolve hardening. "We'll fight from the cabin. We'll make them pay for every inch of ground they take, and if they manage to get in, well, they'll find we're not so easy to kill." His words, intended to be a comfort, were a cold statement of fact. Ayanna nodded, her eyes filled with a sad understanding. "I know how to die," she said quietly. "I just do not wish to die alone." The simple truth of her words hit him with a force that took his breath away. "You won't," he said, his voice husky with emotion. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment, then gently took her hand in his. Her fingers were small and cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "You're not alone, Ayanna. Not anymore." For the first time since they had met, she looked at him not with fear or gratitude, but with a profound sense of trust. A faint smile touched her lips, a fragile blossom in a world of thorns. The moment was broken by the sound of a distant rider. Elias's head snapped up, his hand dropping hers. He listened intently, his soldier's instincts taking over. It was a single rider, and he was approaching fast. He grabbed his rifle and ran to the window. As the rider got closer, he saw that it was Silas. Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Silas was riding hard, his face a grim mask, his old horse lathered with sweat. Silas dismounted, his body shaking with exertion. "They're coming, Elias," he gasped, his voice raspy. "Jebediah and a dozen other men. They're drunk on whiskey and filled with hate. They're saying you're harboring a heathen, and that they're going to burn the place to the ground." "How much time do we have?" Elias asked, his mind already working, calculating. "An hour, maybe 2, Silas said, his chest heaving. "I tried to talk them down, told them it was a fool's errand, but they wouldn't listen. They're too angry, too blind with it." "Thank you, Silas," Elias said, his voice full of gratitude. "You've done more than enough." Silas nodded, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I'll go back to town. Maybe I can convince some of the others to come with me. Good men. They don't agree with what Jebediah's doing, but I can't promise anything, Elias. Just be safe." With a final look of concern, Silas turned and rode back into the darkening evening, his form quickly swallowed by the night. Elias turned to Ayanna, his face set in grim determination. "This is it," he said. "The storm is here." Ayanna, her face pale, nodded. "Then we will stand in the wind," she said, her voice steady. She walked to the fireplace and pulled out a small worn pouch from her tunic. "My mother gave this to me, for protection," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She held it out to him. Elias took the pouch. It was filled with small, smooth stones and a single, tiny feather. It wasn't a weapon. It was a token of faith, a symbol of hope. He looked at her, his heart full. He had seen so much death, so much destruction. He had come to believe that there was nothing left but a cold, hard world. But now, in the face of this beautiful, brave woman, he was reminded that there was still light. There was still a reason to fight. He walked to the window and looked out into the gathering darkness. The wind howled, a low, mournful sound. He checked the loading of his rifle, then the pistol at his hip. He was a soldier again, but with a purpose he had never had before. He wasn't just fighting for a cause. He was fighting for a person, for a life, for a future that was no longer his alone. The storm was coming, but he was ready. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel lonely at all. The first sound was not a gunshot, but the pounding of hooves on the dry earth, a low, menacing rumble that grew louder with every passing second. Elias stood at the window, his rifle raised, his eyes scanning the darkness. Ayana was by his side, the pistol he had given her clutched in her hands, her face a pale mask of concentration. "They're coming from the north," Elias whispered, his voice low and steady. "Stay low. Wait for my command." Ayana nodded, her eyes never leaving the dark expanse outside. The moon was a sliver in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows. The wind had picked up, a mournful wail that masked the sound of their approach. They were a dozen men, their forms dark and ominous against the starlight. Elias recognized a few of them, Jebediah, of course, a big man named Hank, and a few others he had seen around town. They were a motley crew, full of drunken bravado and a hatred that was as old as the land itself. They dismounted 100 yards from the cabin, their voices a low murmur that carried on the wind. Elias could make out fragments of their conversation, threats, taunts, curses. Ayana's grip on the pistol tightened, her knuckles white. "Just stay calm," Elias said, his voice a quiet anchor in the rising storm of her fear. "They're not expecting us to be ready." The men split up, a few of them circling the cabin, their forms barely visible in the darkness. Jebediah and Hank approached the front door. "Elias Thorne!" Jebediah's voice was a cruel, drunken roar. "Come on out, you damn Indian lover. We know you got that squaw in there. Bring her out and we'll let you live." Elias didn't respond. He knew what would happen if he went out there. He wouldn't just be giving them Ayana. He would be giving them his own life. "Fine!" Jebediah roared. "Have it your way!" A bottle of whiskey, its contents on fire, flew through the air, shattering against the side of the cabin, the flames licking at the dry wood. Ayana let out a small gasp of terror. Elias, his face a grim mask, didn't move. He had anticipated this. The cabin was his fortress, and they would not take it down so easily. Another bottle, then another, sailed through the air, striking the cabin with a sickening thud. The small flames began to grow, spreading across the dry wood. "We can't let them burn us out," Ayana said, her voice trembling. "We won't," Elias said, his eyes narrowed. "They're getting careless. They're underestimating us." He took a deep breath. "On the count of 3, Ayana, aim for the lamp on the porch. Me, I'll take Jebediah's hat." It was a risky move, but a necessary one. They had to show them they were not defenseless. 1, Elias whispered. 2, 3. Ayana fired first. The shot was loud in the night, a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. The lamp on the porch shattered, plunging the front of the cabin into darkness. At the same time, Elias fired. The bullet whizzed past Jebediah's head, knocking his hat clean off. Jebediah let out a howl of surprise and rage. The men on the porch scattered, their bravado giving way to fear. "Damn it!" Jebediah roared. "He's armed! He's ready for us!" "I told you he was crazy," Hank muttered, his voice a shaky whisper. The men in the back, hearing the shots, began to fire wildly at the cabin, their bullets thudding harmlessly against the thick log walls. Elias and Ayana, in the darkness, were nothing more than ghosts. "Reload," Elias commanded, his voice a low, urgent murmur. Ayana's hands, though still trembling, worked with a grim determination. She loaded the pistol, her movements quick and precise. The men outside were now completely disoriented, their plans in tatters. They had expected a frightened man and a terrified woman. They had found two determined fighters. "Let's show them what happens when you mess with a thorn," Elias said, a flicker of a grim smile on his lips. He moved to the small loophole he had cut in the wall, his rifle ready. "I'll take the one on the far right. You get the one near the corral." Ayana nodded, her eyes focused, all traces of fear gone from her face. She was a warrior now, a survivor, a protector of her own life. She aimed the pistol and fired. The shot was true, and the man near the corral let out a yelp of pain, clutching his shoulder. Elias's shot was even more precise, and the man on the far right went down with a grunt. The men outside, their numbers dwindling, were in a panic. "Let's get out of here," Hank yelled. "This ain't worth it." Jebediah, however, was not so easily deterred. "No, we're not leaving, not without that squaw." He charged the door, an axe in his hand, a look of pure rage on his face. He slammed the axe against the reinforced door, the wood groaning in protest. Elias turned to Ayana. "He's mine," he said, his voice flat. He reloaded his rifle, his movements a blur of practiced precision. He moved to the door and positioned himself, his rifle aimed at the space where the door was a little thinner. Jebediah swung the axe one last time. The door splintered, a large hole forming. As Jebediah peered through the gap, his eyes full of triumph, Elias fired. The shot was deafening in the small cabin. Jebediah let out a roar of pain, clutching his arm, and stumbled back. He looked at Elias, a look of disbelief and rage in his eyes. He had been defeated. And not by a mob, but by a lone man and a young woman. The rest of the men, seeing their leader defeated, had had enough. They grabbed the wounded, their bravado completely gone, and rode off into the night, their pounding hooves a sound of retreat. The silence that followed was deafening. Ayana, her body trembling with exhaustion, sank to the floor. Elias, his body still tense, lowered his rifle. They had won. They had fought off a mob of armed men. They were safe, at least for now. He looked at Ayana, her face streaked with dirt and gunpowder. She was still a picture of fragile beauty, but there was a new strength in her eyes, a fire that had been forged in the crucible of battle. The fight was over, but the war, Elias knew, was just beginning. They had made a powerful enemy, and they were not going to forget this humiliation, but for now they had a night of peace, a night to heal, a night to rest. And as Elias looked at Ayana, a soft, weary smile on her lips, he knew that they had something worth fighting for, something worth defending. And in that moment, he was no longer a lonely man. He was a man with a purpose, a man with a home, and a man with a future. The sun rose over the valley, its golden light casting a gentle glow on the scarred and battered cabin. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Elias and Ayana sat on the porch, a silent tableau, their bodies aching, their minds exhausted. The air was filled with the acrid scent of burnt wood and gunpowder, a grim reminder of the night's events. Elias had tended to the few broken windows and patched the hole in the door with a piece of wood, but the marks of the attack were still visible. The scorched earth around the cabin, the bullet holes in the walls, they were scars, a testament to the hatred of men and the resilience of two souls. Ayana's face was pale, but her eyes held a new light, a fierce, determined spark. She held a cup of coffee Elias had made for her, her hands wrapped around the warm mug, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The events of the night had changed her. The fear was still there, but it was now tempered by a newfound courage. She had not just survived, she had fought, and she had won. "Are you all right?" Elias asked, his voice low, a new softness in it. He had seen her bravery, her quiet strength in the face of death. She was not just a helpless girl, she was a woman of fierce spirit. Ayana looked at him, a faint smile on her lips. "I am alive," she said simply. "Thanks to you." "We saved each other," Elias corrected, his gaze unwavering. "You were just as brave as any man I've ever known." Ayana looked at her hands, the hands that had loaded a pistol and aimed a gun. She had never imagined she would have to do such a thing. But in the face of danger, a part of her she didn't know existed had emerged. The warrior spirit of her people, perhaps. She didn't know. But she was different now, stronger. "Jebediah and his men," she began, her voice a low murmur. "They will be angry. They will come back. With more men." Elias nodded, his face a grim mask. "I know," he said. "This was just the first round. But they'll be more cautious now. They know we're not easy to beat." He took a long sip of his coffee. "We need a plan. We can't stay here forever." Ayana's eyes widened with surprise. "Leave? This is your home." "It's also a target," Elias said, his voice practical. "They won't stop until they get what they want, and they want you. I won't risk your life for a piece of land, Ayana." She was silent for a long moment, a swirl of emotions in her eyes. Gratitude, of course, but also a deep, abiding sorrow. This was her sanctuary. This was the place where she had found a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. To leave it, it was like being orphaned all over again. "Where would we go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Elias admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe west, to the mountains. There are places where we can disappear, where no one will find us." The thought of leaving everything behind, of becoming a nomad once again, filled her with a sense of dread. But the thought of staying and fighting a war they couldn't win was even worse. "What about you?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "This is your family's land, your home." Elias looked at the scorched earth, the broken door, the bullet holes in the walls. This was a home, yes, but it was also a battlefield. The ghosts of his past were here, and now the shadows of his present were too. "My home is wherever you are, Ayana," he said, the words surprising even him. He had never been a man given to flowery words, to grand pronouncements, but as he looked at her, he knew it to be true. His life had been a lonely, desolate expanse until she had entered it. She was the one who had brought light into the darkness, a sense of purpose into the vast emptiness. Ayana's eyes filled with tears, a silent, profound understanding passing between them. They were two broken souls, two lost souls, and in their shared journey they had found a way to become whole again. The future was uncertain. The past was a landscape of pain, but the present, sitting on the porch of a battered cabin, was a moment of quiet peace, a small reward in a world of turmoil. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, their hands close enough to touch, their minds a sea of shared thought. They had a long road ahead of them, a road of fear and uncertainty, but they would walk it together. They were no longer a man and a woman living in a cabin. They were a family, and for the first time in a long time the lonely rancher felt a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of peace. The decision to leave was not an easy one, but it was a necessary one. They spent the next 2 days preparing for their journey west. Elias packed a small wagon with essentials, food, blankets, tools, and of course their weapons. Ayana, with her intuitive knowledge of the land, helped him pack things they would need for a long journey: dried herbs for medicine, a small pouch of salt, and a fire starter. The ranch, which had been a symbol of their new life, was now a painful reminder of the life they had to leave behind. Elias worked in silence, his face grim, a heavy sense of loss in his heart. This was his legacy, his parents' legacy. To abandon it felt like a betrayal. But as he looked at Ayana, her movements quiet and efficient, a look of serene determination on her face, he knew he was making the right choice. Her life was worth more than any piece of land, no matter how sacred. On the morning of their departure, Elias took one last walk around the property. He stood at the edge of the valley, his eyes scanning the vast, open expanse. The land was beautiful in the morning light, a patchwork of greens and browns, the sky a clear, endless blue. It was his, and he was leaving it. A wave of profound sadness washed over him. Ayana found him there, her presence a silent, comforting anchor. She didn't say anything, She just stood beside him, her hand gently touching his arm. He looked at her, and in her eyes he saw not just a shared sorrow but a shared hope. They were leaving a home, but they were building a new one, a home that was not defined by walls or land, but by the bond between them. He took a deep breath, and together they walked back to the wagon. Sadie, the bay mare, was ready, her harness jingling softly. Ayana's horse, a wild, spirited Mustang she had tamed in the days after she arrived, was tethered to the back of the wagon. They were ready. Elias climbed onto the driver's seat and took the reins. Ayana climbed up beside him, her hand still resting on his arm. He gave a final, mournful look at the cabin, then turned to face the road. "Which way?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur. "West," he said, his voice firm, "towards the mountains, towards a new life." He gave the reins a gentle tug, and the wagon lurched forward, its wheels crunching on the dry dirt. The ranch grew smaller and smaller in the rear view, until it was just a small speck on the horizon. They were on the open road, two strangers who had become a family, their future uncertain, their past a painful memory, but their bond as strong as the mountains they were headed toward. They rode in silence for the rest of the day, the only sound the rhythmic clopping of hooves and the creak of the wagon. As the sun began to set, they found a small sheltered spot near a stream, a perfect place to camp for the night. Elias set up the fire, and Ayana prepared a simple meal of dried meat and beans. The air was cold, the night filled with the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. As they sat by the fire, their faces lit by the dancing flames, Ayana looked at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "Do you think we'll be safe?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. Elias reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I don't know," he said, his voice quiet. "But we'll be together, and that's all that matters." Ayana smiled, a slow, genuine smile that lit up her entire face. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a profound sense of peace. She was no longer running. She was no longer a hunted animal. She was a woman with a man who loved her, with a future that was no longer hers alone. The lonely rancher had returned home to find a lonely girl, and in their shared journey, they had found not just a new life, but a new family. The road ahead was long, but they would walk it together, a new beginning forged in the heart of the Old West. The journey west was a slow, deliberate trudge. The wagon, a sturdy but heavy vessel, was no match for the unforgiving terrain of the American frontier. Elias and Ayana learned to read the land, not as a map of roads and landmarks, but as a living, breathing entity. They followed the whispers of the wind through canyons and the silent wisdom of ancient riverbeds. The days were long, a monotonous rhythm of sunrise and sunset, but the nights were a tapestry of starlight, filled with a silence that was profound and healing. Ayana, who had been raised with an intimate knowledge of the land, became their guide. She could read the tracks of a deer in the dust, point out which berries were safe to eat, and locate hidden springs that Elias would have missed entirely. She was in her element here, her movements fluid and confident, her eyes a mirror of the vast open sky. Elias, the soldier, the rancher, was now a student. He learned to listen to her, to trust her instincts, and in doing so he began to see the world in a new light. One afternoon, as they were cresting a small hill, she stopped the wagon with a gentle tug on the reins. "There is a storm coming," she said, her voice a low murmur. Elias looked up at the sky. The sun was still high, and there wasn't a cloud in sight. "I don't see anything," he said, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Not a storm of rain," she explained, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "A storm of animals." She pointed a small finger to a distant rise. "See the dust? And the birds?" Elias squinted. He saw it then, a faint, swirling cloud of dust, and a small flock of crows circling in the distance. He had never learned to read the signs like this. "What is it?" he asked. "Bison," she said, her eyes shining with a strange mix of reverence and sadness. "They are moving. We must find shelter. They will trample everything in their path." Elias, with a new sense of urgency, turned the wagon toward a small, rocky outcrop. They hid the wagon in the shadows, unhitched the horses, and waited. The low rumble started as a distant thunder, then grew into a powerful, earth-shaking roar. The ground trembled beneath their feet. A few moments later, the great beasts appeared, a sea of brown muscle and fur. They were magnificent, a powerful force of nature, a testament to the untamed wildness of the land. Elias watched them in awe, his hand on Ayana's arm, a sense of wonder filling his heart. He had seen a lot of things in his life, but nothing had prepared him for this. Ayana, however, watched with a sense of quiet sorrow. "My people, they followed the herds," she said, her voice soft. "They hunted only what they needed. They respected the life they took. Now—" She trailed off, a look of profound sadness in her eyes. "Now, the white man, he hunts for sport, for the hide. He leaves the meat to rot. The balance is broken." Her words were a gentle reprimand, a quiet lesson in the ways of the world. Elias felt a pang of guilt. He had grown up with a different perspective, a different way of living. He had never thought about the balance, about the interconnectedness of all things. He was a man of the land, but she was a woman of the earth. The herd passed, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the faint scent of wild grass and ancient earth. The silence that followed was a peaceful, healing balm. They rode on, their journey continuing, but something had shifted between them. Their relationship was no longer just one of a protector and a protected. It was a partnership of equals, a journey of shared discovery. Ayana began to teach him her language, the soft, lilting sounds of her native tongue. He fumbled with the words, his pronunciation clumsy and rough, but he was a willing student. In return, he taught her the stories of his own people, the songs he remembered from his childhood, the things his mother had taught him about the stars. They were two cultures, two worlds, meeting in the middle of a vast, empty wilderness. One night, as they sat by the fire, a sense of profound peace settled over Elias. He had been a man with a home, a soldier, a survivor. But now, he was something else entirely. He was a wanderer, a man with no fixed address, a man with a future that was as uncertain as the next day's weather. But he wasn't afraid. He was with Ayana. And in her presence, he felt a sense of belonging he had never felt before. The lonely rancher was no longer lonely. He was a man on a journey with a woman he was beginning to love, a woman who had taught him how to see the world, not with his eyes, but with his heart. The journey continued, a slow, steady progression westward. They avoided towns and major trails, choosing instead to follow the less traveled paths. They were ghosts in the wilderness, two souls traveling together, their presence a silent secret in the vast landscape. They had enough supplies to last them a few weeks, but Elias knew they would have to find a town soon. The horses needed fresh shoes, and they needed to restock their dwindling supply of flour and coffee. They spotted the town of Redemption from a distance, a small cluster of wooden buildings huddled at the foot of a mountain. Elias felt a familiar knot of apprehension in his stomach. He was no longer just a man in this world. He was a man with a Native American woman by his side, a truth that could bring trouble. "We will not stay long," he assured Ayana, his voice a low murmur. "Just get what we need and go." Ayana, her face a mask of weary resignation, nodded. She knew the dangers as well as he did. But she also knew they had no choice. They rode into town under the cover of a late afternoon sun, the streets dusty and quiet. The few people they saw eyed them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A few men stopped their conversation and watched them with open hostility. Elias ignored them, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on the general store. He tethered the horses and the wagon to a post and turned to Ayana. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "I'll be quick." Ayana shook her head. "No," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I will not let you go in there alone. We are together. We will face this together." Elias looked at her, and in her eyes he saw a resolve that was stronger than his own. He knew he couldn't argue. He had told her that he would never leave her behind, and she was holding him to it. He gave a single, reluctant nod. They walked into the store together, the small bell above the door jingling loudly, a sound that seemed to announce their presence to the world. The store was filled with the scents of leather, tobacco, and dried goods. The store owner, a portly man with a kind face and a neatly trimmed beard, was serving a customer. The customer, a tall, gruff-looking man, saw Ayana and froze, a look of pure hatred in his eyes. He spat on the floor and turned his back on them. The store owner, however, did not flinch. He simply smiled. "Welcome," he said, his voice a low, friendly rumble. "What can I get for you folks?" Elias, surprised by the man's kindness, simply stared for a moment. "We need flour, coffee, and some fresh provisions," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "Coming right up," the store owner said, his smile never faltering. As he was filling their sacks, a young boy, no older than 10, approached Ayana, his eyes filled with a childlike curiosity. "Are you a princess?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Ayana, who had been stiff with tension, looked at the boy, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "No," she said softly. "I am just a woman. Like your mother." The boy, unabashed, took a step closer. "You're beautiful," he said. The boy's mother, a tired-looking woman with a baby on her hip, came and pulled the boy away. "Leave them be, Billy," she scolded. "They're not like us." "But she's nice, Ma," the boy protested. The store owner, who had heard the exchange, simply shook his head. "Don't you worry about him, Mom," he said to Ayana. "He's just a boy with a good heart." Elias paid for the goods, and as they were leaving, the store owner, a man named Robert, called out to them. "The blacksmith's name is John," he said. "He's a good man. Tell him I sent you." The kindness was a shock, a sudden burst of sunlight in a long, dark journey. Ayana's hand, which had been tense, now relaxed. Elias felt a small measure of hope in his heart. The world wasn't all hatred and violence. There were still good people in it. They found the blacksmith, a strong, silent man with a face blackened by soot. He looked at Ayana, then at Elias, his gaze steady and serious. "Robert sent you?" he asked, his voice a deep rumble. Elias nodded. "We need shoes for the horses," he said, "and a place to stay for the night." John nodded. "The horses will be ready by morning," he said. "As for a place to stay, my wife, she's got a spare room. We don't get many travelers, but you're welcome to it." They spent the night in the blacksmith's humble home, a small, comfortable cottage filled with the scent of wood smoke and a simmering stew. John's wife, a kind woman with a warm smile, welcomed Ayana with open arms. They talked about their journey, about the dangers they had faced, and for the first time Elias and Ayana were not just two people on the run, but two people sharing their story with others. The next morning, as they were leaving, John and his wife stood on the porch waving goodbye. "Safe travels," John called out, "and remember, there's always a place for you here. You're not alone." The words, simple as they were a profound gift. They had found kindness in the most unexpected of places, a small pocket of humanity in a world of turmoil. As they rode out of town, the small, dusty streets of redemption seemed to glow with a quiet light. Elias looked at Ayana, a new sense of hope in his heart. The journey was long and uncertain, but they had found a friend, and in the vast, lonely wilderness, a single friend was worth more than all the gold in the world. Their journey continued, but the memory of the kindness they had received in redemption remained with them, a small fire of hope in the vast wilderness. They were 2 weeks out, their destination still a distant mirage, when they saw a familiar figure riding toward them. Elias's hand went to his pistol, his body tensing for a fight. But as the figure got closer, he saw that it was Silas, the blacksmith from Harmony Creek. Silas dismounted, his face a grim mask, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. "I've been looking for you, Elias," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Heard you left. Figured you would." He looked at Ayana, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "And I see you're still together." "What's wrong, Silas?" Elias asked, his heart pounding in his chest. "Why are you here?" "They came back," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "Jebediah and his men. They were mad as hell. They said you got away and that you'd be coming back. They're waiting for you. They've been watching the ranch waiting for you to return." Elias's jaw tightened. "I figured as much," he said, his voice flat. "They're not going to get what they want." "That's not all," Silas said, a new note of urgency in his voice. They've been talking about the girl. They're saying she's a curse, that she's bringing bad luck to the land. They've been trying to get the others to join them. They're forming a mob, Elias. A real one this time. A few good men from town. They're getting scared. They don't want to get involved. Ayana, who had been listening in silence, took a small step back, a look of profound fear on her face. The hatred, the prejudice, it had followed them. It was a ghost that haunted her every step. "We're not going back," Elias said, his voice firm. "We're heading west." "You can't, Elias," Silas said, shaking his head. "They've already sent men to look for you. They're searching all the trails, all the passes. They're not going to stop until they find you. And they're going to use her as a scapegoat. They're going to use her to justify their hatred." The words were a cold slap in the face. Elias had hoped that by leaving they could escape the hatred, but it was a part of this land, a part of this time. It was a sickness that infected everything. "What do we do?" Ayana asked, her voice a low, terrified whisper. Elias looked at her, his mind racing. He was a soldier, a strategist. He knew he couldn't fight an army, but he also knew he couldn't let them win. He looked at Silas, his eyes a mix of desperation and resolve. "You came all this way just to warn us?" he asked. Silas nodded. "I had to," he said, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. "You're a good man, Elias, and that girl, she's a good girl. She doesn't deserve this. No one does." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small bag of coins. "Here," he said, holding it out to Elias. "It's not much, but it's enough to get you to the next town. Buy some new supplies and stay away from the main roads. Head for the mountains. Hide." Elias took the bag of coins, the weight of the silver a heavy reminder of the sacrifice Silas was making. He was risking his own life to help them. "Thank you, Silas," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." "Just live," Silas said, his eyes a quiet testament to his belief in them. "Just be happy. That's all the payment I need." He gave a final nod, then turned and rode off, his form quickly disappearing into the dust. Elias and Ayana stood there, two solitary figures in the vast wilderness, the weight of their past and the fear of their future, a heavy burden. They were no longer just running from a threat. They were running from an entire way of life, from a prejudice that was as old as the mountains themselves. "They're not going to give up, are they?" Ayana asked, her voice filled with a terrible certainty. "No," Elias said, his voice a grim whisper. "They're not." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not just a man on the run, but a man with a purpose, a man who would fight with every fiber of his being to protect her. "But neither are we," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "We're going to keep going. We're going to find a place where we can be safe, and if we have to fight every step of the way, then so be it. We're not alone in this, Ayana. We have a friend, and we have each other." He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, a silent promise of his love and his protection. They were on the run, yes, but they were also on a journey of two souls, fighting for their right to be together, fighting for their right to be free. The journey continued, now with a new sense of urgency. Silas's warning had been a cold dose of reality, a harsh reminder that the world was still a dangerous place. They kept to the high country, traveling at night, and hiding the wagon in the thickets of trees during the day. They were a shadow, a whisper in the wind. Elias the soldier was in his element. He was a master of evasion, a ghost in the wilderness. Ayana, the daughter of the earth, was his silent partner, her knowledge of the land a priceless weapon. They had not seen another soul for days. The silence of the mountains was a peaceful, healing balm. They found a secluded spot near a clear, cold stream, a perfect place to rest and recover. Elias set up a small camp, his movements quiet and efficient. Ayana, a small smile on her face, gathered wild onions and mushrooms, a fresh meal after days of salted meat. As they sat by the fire, the stars a vast glittering blanket above them, a sense of peace settled over them. They were alone in the world, a world of their own making. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. "Do you ever miss it?" Ayana asked, her voice a soft murmur. "The ranch? Your home?" Elias looked into the fire, his expression thoughtful. "I used to think that's all I wanted," he said. "To go home. To be the man I was before the war. To fix the place up. To live a normal life." He looked at her and a small, genuine smile touched his lips. "But I realized that home wasn't just a place, it was a feeling of belonging, a feeling of peace. I didn't find that when I got back to the ranch. I found it when I found you." Ayana's eyes, dark and luminous in the firelight, filled with a quiet joy. "I feel the same," she said, her voice barely audible. "My home. It was taken from me. My family. They are gone. But with you, I feel like I am home." The words were a profound gift, a testament to the love that was blossoming between them. It was a love born of shared pain and shared hope, a love that had grown in the silent spaces between them. It was not a love that needed grand gestures or flowery words. It was a love that was as solid and real as the earth beneath their feet. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I will never let anyone hurt you, Ayana," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will protect you with my life." She squeezed his hand, her gaze steady and serious. "I know," she said, "but you do not have to fight alone. We will fight together. We will find our place, a place where we can be free." The next morning they continued their journey, their hearts filled with a new sense of purpose. They were no longer just on the run. They were on a mission to find a new beginning, a place where their love could grow, where they could build a life together, free from the shadows of their past. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape changed. The dry, dusty plains gave way to lush green forests and towering peaks. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. This was a new world, a world that felt wild and untamed and full of possibilities. Ayana, her face alight with excitement, pointed to a distant mountain peak. "The sacred mountain," she said, her voice filled with reverence. "My people, they say it is a place of peace, a place where the spirits rest." Elias looked at the mountain, its peak shrouded in a light mist. It was a beautiful, majestic sight. He didn't believe in spirits, not in the way she did. But he believed in the power of a new beginning, in the power of hope. And as he looked at the mountain, he felt a sense of peace he had not felt since his childhood. They were getting closer, closer to their new home, closer to their new life. The peace of the mountains was a fragile thing, easily shattered. A week into their journey through the high country, Elias's instincts, honed by years of war, told him they were no longer alone. He felt a prickling at the back of his neck, a sense of being watched. He didn't see anyone, but he felt their presence, a low hum of malevolence that cut through the stillness of the mountain air. "We have company," he said to Ayana, his voice a low, grim murmur. Ayana's body tensed. She looked around, her eyes scanning the dense forest. "They are from the south," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "3 men. They are moving fast." Her instincts were as sharp as his. They were in a race now, a race for their lives. Elias changed their course, heading for a higher, more rugged pass, a place where the terrain would be their greatest defense. They pushed the horses to their limits, the wagon bumping and swaying over the rocky ground. They made camp under the cover of a thick pine forest, their fire a small, flickering beacon in the darkness. Elias was on high alert, his rifle in his hands, his gaze fixed on the shadows. He didn't want to leave. He knew that if they kept moving at night, they would be even more vulnerable. But he also knew that if they stayed in one place for too long, they would be found. As he was standing watch, a low, mournful howl echoed through the canyon. It was the howl of a coyote. Ayana, who had been sleeping, sat up, her eyes wide with fear. "That is not a coyote," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That is a signal." Elias's heart sank. They had found them. They were circling, closing in for the kill. The hunter had become the hunted. He grabbed his rifle and turned to Ayana. "We need to go," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." They moved through the night, a silent, desperate flight. The terrain was treacherous and the cold was a biting enemy. They were running on pure adrenaline, and a grim, stubborn will to survive. Elias knew they couldn't outrun them forever. The men were on horseback and they were fresh. He had to set a trap, a final stand. He found the perfect spot, a narrow gorge with a sheer rock face on one side and a thicket of tangled trees on the other. It was a bottleneck, a place where they could fight on their own terms. He unhitched the wagon and turned it to face the gorge, a makeshift barricade. He took his rifle and positioned himself behind a large boulder, his gaze fixed on the entrance of the gorge. Ayanna, her pistol clutched in her hands, hid behind another boulder, her face a mask of weary resignation. They waited. The silence was deafening, a thick, heavy blanket of tension. They could hear the approaching horses now, their hooves a soft, rhythmic thud against the earth. They were getting closer. Elias took a deep breath, his hands steady on his rifle. He had been in these situations before, 1,000 times. He knew the drill. The adrenaline, the focus, the cold, calculating mind. But this time it was different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for a cause, he was fighting for her. He was fighting for their future. The first rider appeared, a tall, burly man on a powerful-looking horse. He was followed by 2 others, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hats. They were a grim, determined bunch. They were not just a drunken mob. They were professional hunters, and they had found their prey. "Elias Thorne!" one of them called out, his voice a cruel, mocking laugh. "Come on out, boy! We know you're in there, and we want our reward!" Elias didn't respond. He just waited, his finger on the trigger, his gaze fixed on the first rider. The man dismounted, his rifle in his hands, a look of grim determination on his face. He began to walk toward the barricade. Elias waited. He waited for the right moment. The moment when he could take them all down. The man stepped into the light of the moon, and Elias took a breath, his finger tightening on the trigger. Ayanna, from her hiding spot, let out a small, quiet gasp. The man was a ghost of her past, a ghost of her nightmare. He was one of the men who had attacked her village, one of the men who had killed her family, the hunter, the killer, and now he was standing right in front of her. The sight of the man, the killer from her past, sent a jolt of icy fear through Ayanna. Her hands, which had been steady just moments before, began to tremble. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories, of fire, of screams, of her father's face, a final, desperate plea for her to run. This was not just a fight for survival anymore. It was a confrontation with her past, a chance for a kind of justice she never thought she would have. Elias, seeing the look on her face, the way her body was tense with a mixture of fear and rage, knew this was a moment of profound importance. He lowered his rifle, his mind racing. He could take the shot now. He could end the threat. But he knew that this was her fight, her chance to face her demons. "Ayanna," he whispered, his voice low and urgent, "take the shot." She looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. But I can't," she stammered. "You can," Elias said, his voice firm, unwavering. "This is your fight, your chance. This is not about me, this is about you. You deserve this." She looked from Elias to the man who had destroyed her life, and a wave of raw, unadulterated hatred washed over her. She raised the pistol, her hand still trembling but a new resolve shining in her eyes. The man was now just a few feet away from the barricade, his gaze fixed on the wagon, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. He was so close to his prize. He didn't see her. He didn't see the silent, trembling girl with the pistol. He only saw a chance for vengeance. Ayanna took a deep breath, her eyes narrowed, her finger on the trigger. She remembered her father's last words, his face filled with a love that transcended even death. She remembered the fire, the smoke, the faces of her people. All gone. She was the last one left, the last one with a chance to make things right. She aimed the pistol, her gaze fixed on the man's heart. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was loud and clean, a sharp crack that echoed through the canyon. The man, his smirk of triumph still on his face, looked down at the small black hole in his chest. A look of profound surprise, followed by a wave of pain, crossed his face. He stumbled back, his body swaying, then fell to the ground, a silent, crumpled heap. The other two riders, hearing the shot, dismounted and took cover, their faces filled with confusion and fear. They had not expected this. They had expected a frightened man, a helpless woman. They had found two people who were not afraid to fight back. "They're coming for us," one of them yelled. "Let's get out of here," the other one said, his voice a shaky whisper. They mounted their horses and rode off into the darkness, leaving their fallen comrade behind. The hunter had become the hunted, and the prey had won. Ayana, her body trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and exhaustion, sank to the ground, the pistol falling from her numb fingers. Elias rushed to her side, wrapping his arms around her. She was shaking, her body convulsing with a silent, heart-wrenching sobs. The tears, which she had held back for so long, now flowed freely, a cleansing river of grief and relief. "It's over," Elias whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's over, Ayana. He can't hurt you anymore." She clung to him, her body shaking, her sobs a raw, primal sound. She had faced her demon. She had defeated him. But the victory was a hollow one. It didn't bring back her family. It didn't heal her wounds. It just gave her a sense of peace, a sense of closure she had never thought she would have. They sat there for a long time, the two of them, in the silent, lonely canyon, the body of the dead man, a grim reminder of the violence of the world. But in the midst of the pain and the grief, there was also a profound sense of hope. They had faced their past, and they had survived. They were stronger now, more resilient, more determined than ever to find a place where they could be safe, where they could be happy. The morning after was a quiet one. They buried the man in an unmarked grave, a silent, somber farewell. They packed up the wagon, their movements slow and deliberate. As they were about to leave, Ayana looked back at the grave. "Rest in peace," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. "You have no power over me anymore." Elias looked at her, his heart full. The girl he had found in the dusty cabin was gone. In her place was a woman of fierce strength, a woman who had faced her demons and had come out on the other side. They were still on the run. The world was still a dangerous place, but they had faced the worst of it, and they had won. They were together, and in their shared victory, they had found a new beginning. The successful confrontation in the canyon had a profound effect on Ayana. The act of facing her past and overcoming it had filled her with a newfound sense of strength and confidence. She walked with a different posture, her head held higher, her gaze no longer filled with a constant underlying fear. The ghost of her past had been laid to rest. Their journey continued, now with a sense of purpose. They were no longer just running. They were seeking. They were searching for a place they could call home, a place where they could build a life together, free from the shadows of their past. Days turned into weeks. The high mountains gave way to a vast, open desert. The sun was a harsh, unforgiving enemy, and the land was a barren, desolate expanse. Water was scarce and their supplies were dwindling. Elias, the rancher, was in his element. He knew how to survive in a harsh, unforgiving land. He knew how to find water, how to hunt for food, how to read the signs of the desert. One afternoon, as the sun was beating down on them, Ayana stopped the wagon, her face a mask of weary exhaustion. "I cannot go on," she said, her voice a dry, raspy whisper. "The heat. It is too much." Elias, his own body aching with exhaustion, knew she was right. They couldn't go on. Not like this. He looked around, his eyes scanning the horizon. The landscape was a desolate expanse of sand and rock. There was no shelter, no water. They were in trouble. He unhitched the horses and helped Ayana to the ground, his body swaying with exhaustion. He gave her the last of their water, a small, precious sip, then took the rifle and walked toward a small rise, his mind racing. He had to find something, a sign, a glimmer of hope. He reached the top of the rise and looked out. The landscape was a vast, unending expanse of sand and rock. His heart sank. They were stranded. They were going to die here. He was about to turn back when he saw it, a flicker of green in the distance, a small, almost imperceptible patch of color in a sea of brown and gold. His heart leaped in his chest. It was a mirage. It had to be. but he had to be sure. He started to walk toward it, his steps slow and deliberate. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows on the land. He walked for what felt like an eternity, his body screaming in protest, his mind a whirlwind of hope and desperation. He was just about to give up when he saw it again, closer this time. A small dark patch of trees, a small shimmering body of water, an oasis. It was not a mirage, it was real. He ran back to Ayana, his heart pounding with a wild, joyous rhythm. "I found it," he gasped, his voice filled with a wild, joyous relief. "An oasis, water, trees. We're going to be okay." Ayana, who had been sitting on the ground, a look of profound resignation on her face, looked at him, and a small, hopeful smile touched her lips. "I told you we would find our place," she said, her voice a low, raspy whisper. "I told you we would be safe." They loaded the wagon and rode toward the oasis, the setting sun a fiery beacon behind them. As they got closer, they saw that it was more than just a small patch of trees and a pool of water. It was a small, vibrant ecosystem. The air was filled with the scent of wildflowers and the sound of birdsong. The water was clear and cold, a welcome relief from the burning heat of the desert. They made camp under the shade of a large, gnarled tree, their bodies aching, their minds exhausted, but filled with a profound sense of gratitude. They drank the cool, refreshing water, their thirst quenched, their bodies renewed. They ate the wild berries they found, a sweet, juicy feast after days of dry, tasteless food. That night, as they sat by the fire, their bodies rested, their minds at peace, they looked at each other, and a single, profound understanding passed between them. They had faced a mob of angry men, a vengeful killer, and a vast, unforgiving desert. They had survived it all. They had faced a past filled with pain and a future filled with uncertainty, but they had faced it together, and in their shared victory, they had found a place of peace, a place they could call their own. An oasis in the desert, a new beginning. The oasis was more than just a temporary refuge. It was an unexpected and perfect home. Tucked away in a small valley, it was hidden from the main trails and difficult to find. The water source was a natural spring, providing a constant flow of clear, fresh water. The land around it was fertile, a lush green paradise in the middle of a barren desert. It was a secret, a private sanctuary, a gift from the universe. Elias the rancher and Ayana, the daughter of the earth, were in their element. They worked together, their movements a synchronized dance of creation. Elias used his knowledge of construction to build a small, simple cabin from the wood of the surrounding trees. He was strong, his hands calloused and capable, and he worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by a purpose he had never felt before. Ayana, with her intimate knowledge of the land, created a garden. She found seeds from the wildflowers, planted vegetables, and nurtured them with the clear, cool water from the spring. She knew which plants were good for medicine, which berries were edible, and which roots were full of nourishment. She was a creator, a life-giver, a quiet force of nature. The days melted into one another, a blur of work and quiet conversation. Their love, which had been forged in the fires of conflict, now blossomed in the quiet peace of their new home. They were no longer just two people on the run. They were a family. Their days were a simple, peaceful rhythm of work, rest, and love. They would work in the garden, build the cabin, and then, in the evening, they would sit by the fire, their hands clasped together, their voices a low, murmured stream of conversation. They talked about their pasts, not with a sense of pain or sorrow, but with a quiet understanding. They shared stories of their families, their childhoods, their dreams. Elias told her about his father, a man of quiet strength and a deep love for the land. He told her about his mother, a woman of fierce spirit and a gentle heart. He told her about his time in the war, the horrors he had witnessed, the men he had lost. He told her about his loneliness, his profound sense of loss, his deep, abiding grief. Ayana, in return, told him about her people, the beautiful ancient traditions, the songs, the stories, the dances. She told him about her father, a man of great wisdom and a deep love for his family. She told him about her mother, a woman of quiet strength and a heart filled with a profound sense of peace. She told him about the massacre, the fire, the fear, the pain, the grief. She told him about her loneliness, her sense of being the last one left, the profound weight of her loss. In their shared stories, they found a kind of healing. They were two broken souls, but in their shared sorrow they found a way to become whole again. The oasis was not just a home, it was a sanctuary for their hearts, a place where their wounds could heal, where their pasts could be laid to rest. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow on the cabin, Ayana looked at him, her eyes shining in the soft light. "I am happy," she said, her voice a soft, loving whisper. "I have never been so happy in my life." Elias looked at her, his heart full. He had lost his home, his family, his past. He had fought a war, faced a mob, and survived a desert. But in the end, he had found something more precious than all the gold in the world. He had found a new life, a new home, and a love that was as deep and vast as the endless sky above them. The lonely rancher was no longer lonely. He was a man with a purpose, a man with a home, and a man with a beautiful, resilient Native American wife. Their journey was not over, but for now they were at peace. They were home. Life at the oasis settled into a rhythm of serene simplicity. The days were filled with work, the evenings with quiet conversation by the fire. Their world was small, a self-contained universe of two souls, but it was a world that felt complete. Elias finished the cabin, a sturdy, simple structure that was a testament to his craftsmanship. Ayana's garden flourished, a vibrant patch of green in the midst of the desert. They were a team, their lives intertwined, their goals aligned. Their love, which had been a quiet, unspoken thing, now blossomed into a deep, profound connection. It was a love that was built not on passion, but on a foundation of trust, respect, and shared experience. They knew each other's fears, each other's hopes, each other's dreams. They were two halves of a whole, two souls who had been lost and had found each other. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, the stars a vast glittering blanket above them, Ayana looked at Elias, her eyes filled with a quiet seriousness. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice a low murmur. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what she was going to say. He looked at her, his gaze steady and serious. "What is it?" he asked. "I am going to have a baby," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and joy. Elias's mind went blank. A baby, a family, a new life. The words were a beautiful, terrifying sound. He looked at her, and in her eyes he saw the same fear, the same hope. This was a new chapter, a new beginning, a new challenge. "A baby," he whispered, his voice filled with a sense of wonder. "Our baby." He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise of his love and his protection. The news was a profound shift in their lives. They were no longer just two people living in a cabin. They were a family. They were building a future, not just for themselves, but for their child. The work on the oasis took on a new sense of urgency. They needed to make it a home, a safe haven for their child. Elias built a small cradle, his hands, which had built a cabin and fired a rifle, now working with a gentle, loving precision. Ayana sewed small clothes from the softest cloth she could find, her fingers, which had wrapped a wound and loaded a pistol, now working with a mother's love. The days passed, a rhythm of work, rest, and quiet conversation. They talked about names, about the future, about the kind of world they wanted their child to grow up in. It was a world of peace, of love, of acceptance. It was a world that they would have to build for themselves. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, a sense of profound peace settled over Elias. He had been a lonely man, a man with no future, no hope, no family. But now, he was a man with a purpose. He was a man with a home. He was a man with a wife he loved more than life itself. And soon, he would be a father. He looked at Ayana, her face serene and beautiful in the firelight. The lonely rancher had returned home, not to a dusty, broken cabin, but to a life he had never thought possible. A life filled with love, a life filled with hope, a life filled with a beautiful, unexpected reward, a beautiful native wife, and a family they had built together. The journey was not over, but they were no longer just on the road. They were on the path to a new beginning. The oasis had become a world unto itself, a private sanctuary of peace and love. Elias and Ayana were a self-sufficient unit, their days a quiet rhythm of work, and their nights a profound tapestry of shared dreams. Ayana's pregnancy was a source of immense joy and a new kind of purpose. Elias was more vigilant than ever, his watchful eyes constantly scanning the horizon, but he was also more at peace than he had ever been. He was not just a survivor anymore, he was a protector, a man with a family to defend. Months passed and the desert spring became a beautiful, hidden home. They had built a life, brick by painstaking brick, and they were happy. But the peace they had found was as fragile as a desert flower. The world outside, a world of hatred and vengeance, was a constant, lurking threat. They had not seen another soul since their confrontation with the killers in the canyon, and in the deep quiet of the oasis, it was easy to forget the dangers they had escaped. One afternoon, as Ayana was tending to her garden, a sudden cold wind swept through the valley. The air, which had been warm and still, now carried a strange, acrid scent. It was the scent of dust and of something else, something familiar and terrifying. Elias, who had been chopping wood near the cabin, felt an instinctive prickling at the back of his neck. He dropped the axe and grabbed his rifle, his senses on high alert. "Do you smell that?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Ayana, her face pale, nodded. "Smoke," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "And horses." Elias ran to a small rise he had been using as a lookout point. He peered over the edge, his heart pounding in his chest. In the distance, a large dust cloud was rising, a grim, dark plume against the afternoon sky. It was not a herd of animals. It was a group of men on horseback, a dozen or more, and they were heading straight for the oasis. His worst fears had been realized. Jebediah and his mob had not given up. They had been relentless in their search, and they had finally found their target. He ran back to the cabin, his mind racing. There was no time to run. There was no place to hide. Their sanctuary had been discovered. He grabbed Ayana's hand, his grip tight. "They're here," he said, his voice a low, grim whisper. "We have to fight." Ayana, her face a mask of weary resignation, nodded. She was not a warrior, but she was a survivor. She was a mother. She would fight for her child. "We will not let them take our home," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, fierce determination. They barricaded themselves in the cabin, their rifles and pistols ready. The men's voices, a low, angry murmur, were now audible. Elias could hear Jebediah's gravelly roar, his voice filled with a vengeful triumph. "Found you, you son of a gun," he yelled. "Thought you could hide out here forever, did you? Well, you got another thing coming. We're going to burn this place to the ground, and we're going to take what's ours." The words were a brutal reminder of the hatred that had followed them across the country. They were a threat, a promise of violence. But Elias was no longer afraid. He was filled with a cold, clear rage. They had trespassed on his land. They had threatened his family. They had found his home, and they would not be leaving it in one piece. He positioned himself at a small loophole he had cut in the wall, his rifle aimed and ready. Ayana, her pistol clutched in her hands, stood by his side, her body a silent testament to her courage. They were two people, a family, against a mob of angry, vengeful men. The odds were against them, but they were not alone. They had each other, and they would fight to the very end. The first shot was a clean, sharp crack that echoed through the valley. It was the beginning of a final, desperate battle for their home, for their love, for their lives. The lonely rancher had returned home, not just to a piece of land, but to a family, a future, and a fight worth fighting. And in that moment, he was no longer a lonely man. He was a man with a purpose, a man with a home, and a man with a beautiful Native American wife, a woman who would stand and fight by his side to the very end. The battle for the oasis was a brutal and chaotic affair. Jebediah's men, fueled by whiskey and a burning sense of injustice, charged the cabin with a wild, reckless abandon. Elias, his mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations, fired with a cold, detached precision. He had been a soldier for years. This was a war he knew how to fight. He took down two men with clean, sharp shots, their bodies crumpling to the ground with a sickening thud. The rest of the mob, surprised by the fierce resistance, scattered, taking cover behind the trees and boulders that surrounded the cabin. Ayana, her hands steady, fired her pistol with a silent, grim determination. She was a warrior in her own right, a quiet force of nature. She had faced this kind of violence before, and she was no longer afraid. She aimed for the men's legs, their arms, their shoulders. She didn't want to kill them. She just wanted them to leave. Jebediah, however, was not so easily deterred. He was a man consumed by hatred, a man who would not rest until he had what he wanted. He ordered his men to set fire to the trees around the cabin, a last desperate attempt to smoke them out. The men, their faces grim, obeyed, and a series of flaming arrows soared through the air, landing in the dry brush that surrounded the cabin. The flames, a hungry, living thing, began to spread, a fiery wall of destruction that threatened to consume their home. "The fire!" Ayana cried out, her voice filled with a terrible fear. Elias, his mind racing, knew they had to act fast. They couldn't fight the fire and the men at the same time. He grabbed a bucket of water from the cabin and ran outside, a makeshift fire extinguisher. He doused the flames, his body a blur of frantic motion. But as he was doing so, a man charged him from the side, a large knife in his hand. Elias was ready. He ducked under the man's wild swing, his body twisting with a practiced grace. He brought the butt of his rifle up, a sharp, precise blow to the man's jaw. The man went down, a silent, crumpled heap on the ground. But as he was getting back to his feet, another man, a large, burly brute, charged him from behind, a look of pure rage on his face. Just as the man was about to bring his rifle down on Elias's head, a shot rang out. The man, a look of surprise on his face, stumbled, clutching his shoulder. Ayana stood in the doorway of the cabin, her pistol in her hands, her face a mask of grim determination. She had saved his life. Again. The battle raged on, a back-and-forth volley of gunshots and shouts. Elias and Ayana, a silent, efficient team, fought with a fierce, desperate courage. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they had something the mob did not: a reason to fight. They were not fighting for a misplaced sense of honor or for a misguided hatred. They were fighting for their love, for their home, for their child. Jebediah, seeing his men falling, their morale shattered, decided to take matters into his own hands. He charged the cabin, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was not a man to be reasoned with. He was a man who wanted a kill. Elias, his body aching, his mind exhausted, knew this was it, the final stand. He waited for Jebediah, his rifle aimed and ready. He was not a killer, but he was a protector. He would do whatever it took to keep his family safe. Jebediah burst through the door, his eyes filled with a cruel, triumphant fire. "You're done, Elias!" he roared, his voice filled with a final, vengeful triumph. Ayana, who had been hiding behind the door, raised her pistol. But before she could fire, Elias stepped forward. He would not let her get hurt. He would not let her kill another man. "This is between you and me, Jebediah," he said, his voice low and firm. "Leave her out of this." Jebediah laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Leave her out of this. She's the reason we're here, you idiot. She's a damn heathen. She's a curse." Elias's jaw tightened. "She's my wife," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "And this is my home. You're not taking either one." Jebediah lunged at him, his knife glinting in the firelight. Elias, with a practiced grace, stepped aside, his rifle a blur of motion. The butt of the rifle struck Jebediah in the jaw, a sharp, precise blow. Jebediah staggered back, his body swaying, his mind a whirlwind of pain and confusion. Before he could recover, Elias brought the butt of the rifle down on his head, a final, decisive blow. Jebediah fell to the ground, a silent, crumpled heap, his body still. He was not dead, but he was defeated. The rest of the men, seeing their leader defeated, their ranks decimated, had had enough. They grabbed their wounded and fled, their pounding hooves a sound of final, humiliating defeat. The battle was over. The oasis was safe. Elias, his body shaking with exhaustion, leaned against the wall, his rifle still in his hands. He looked at Ayana, her face a mask of weary relief. She ran to him, her body trembling, and wrapped her arms around him, her face buried in his chest. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice filled with a terrible, joyous relief. "We saved each other," he said, his voice filled with a profound sense of gratitude. "We're safe now, Ayana. We're home." The morning after the battle was a quiet, somber one. The land around the oasis, once a peaceful sanctuary, was now a grim, scarred landscape. The ground was littered with spent shells, broken arrows, and the remains of the mob's failed attack. The cabin, a testament to their resilience, stood proud and defiant in the midst of the destruction. Elias, his body aching, his mind exhausted, walked the perimeter of their home, his gaze fixed on the traces of the violence that had so recently engulfed them. He saw the fire-scorched earth, the bullet holes in the cabin walls, the bloodstains on the ground. He had faced down a mob of angry men and had come out on top. But the victory was a hollow one. It didn't change the fact that the world was still a dangerous place. It didn't change the fact that they had been found. Ayana, her face pale, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness, walked with him. She looked at the scars on the land, a grim reminder of the hatred that had followed them across the country. "They will not come back," she said, her voice a low murmur. "They will be afraid. They have been defeated." Elias nodded, but he knew better. Vengeance was a powerful thing. It was a poison that could consume a man, a sickness that could fester for a lifetime. Jebediah and his men would not forget this humiliation. They would not forget this defeat. They would be back, sooner or later. "We cannot stay here forever," he said, his voice a weary whisper. "This is not a home, it's a battlefield." Ayana looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and understanding. "Then what do we do?" she asked. "We keep going," Elias said, his voice firm, resolute. "We keep moving. We find a place where they will never find us, a place where we can truly be safe." The decision to leave their oasis, the home they had built with their own hands, was a painful one, but it was a necessary one. They spent the next 2 days packing, their movements slow and deliberate. They were no longer just a man and a woman on the run. They were a family, a unit, a small, fragile beacon of hope in a world of turmoil. As they were leaving, Elias took one last look at the cabin, his heart filled with a profound sense of loss. He had built this home with love and hope, and now he was leaving it, a scar on the face of a beautiful, peaceful valley. But as he looked at Ayana, her face serene and beautiful, a hand resting on her stomach, a sense of hope, a new kind of purpose, filled his heart. They were not running from a home. They were running toward a future that was no longer just his alone, a future that was filled with a promise of a new life, a new beginning. Their journey west continued, but this time it was different. They were no longer just seeking a safe place to hide. They were seeking a place to belong, a place where they could raise their child, a place where their love could grow, a place where they could truly be free. They rode for weeks, their journey a slow, steady progression toward the unknown. The landscape changed, the desert giving way to a vast open plain. The air was filled with the scent of wild grass and the distant rumble of thunder. It was a beautiful, untamed land, a land that felt full of endless possibilities. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, they crested a small hill. The view before them took Elias's breath away. A vast open valley stretched before them, a lush green paradise nestled between 2 towering mountain ranges. A wide, gentle river, its waters a shimmering silver in the dying light, snaked its way through the valley. It was a place of profound, undeniable beauty. It was a place that felt like home. Ayana, her face alight with excitement, pointed to a small hidden cave in the side of a mountain, a perfect natural shelter. "Look," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, joyous wonder. "Our new home." Elias looked at her, his heart full. He had spent his life running, fighting, searching for something he couldn't name. He had lost his home, his family, his past. But in the end, he had found something more precious than all the gold in the world. He had found a new life, a new home. and a beautiful, resilient Native American wife, a woman who had taught him how to love, how to hope, how to be a man. The new home was a gift from the heavens. The cave was a perfect natural shelter, a safe haven from the elements and from the outside world. The valley was a lush, green paradise filled with a bounty of wild game, fish, and berries. It was a place of profound, undeniable beauty, a place of peace. Elias and Ayanna, their hearts filled with a quiet, joyous sense of purpose, began to build their new life. Elias, the rancher, built a small, simple cabin inside the cave, a cozy, warm space that was a testament to his love and his determination. He fashioned a small, sturdy cradle from the wood of the surrounding trees, his hands, which had fired a rifle and built a fortress, now working with a gentle, loving precision. Ayanna, the daughter of the earth, created a garden, a vibrant, lush patch of green that was a testament to her love for the land and for the life that was growing inside her. She taught Elias the secrets of the valley, the names of the plants, the songs of the birds, the stories of the stars. She was a teacher, a guide, a quiet force of nature. The days passed, a rhythm of work, rest, and quiet conversation. Their love, which had been forged in the fires of conflict, now blossomed in the quiet peace of their new home. They were no longer just two people on the run. They were a family. Their days were a simple, peaceful rhythm of work, rest, and love. One night, as the moon was a silver crescent in the sky, Ayanna's labor began. It was a long and difficult birth, a painful and beautiful journey. Elias, his face a mask of fear and worry, was by her side, holding her hand, his voice a low, reassuring murmur. He had faced down a mob of angry men, a vengeful killer, and a vast, unforgiving desert. But in this moment, he was just a man filled with a profound, terrifying love for the woman he was about to become a father with. Hours later, as the sun began to rise, the sound of a baby's cry filled the air. It was a small, high-pitched wail, a beautiful, perfect sound. Elias looked at Ayanna, her face a mask of exhaustion and joy. She was a mother. She was a creator. She had brought a new life into the world. He looked at the baby, a small, tiny bundle of life wrapped in a soft blanket. The baby was beautiful, with Ayanna's dark, luminous eyes and Elias's dark, thick hair. It was a boy, their son. Ayanna, her voice a low, loving whisper, looked at him. "His name is Samuel," she said. "It means heard by God." Elias, tears streaming down his face, simply nodded. He was a father. He was a protector. He was a man with a family. He had lost everything, but in the end he had gained something more precious than all the gold in the world. He had gained a family, a future, a reason to live. The lonely rancher was no longer lonely. He was a man with a purpose, a man with a home, and a man with a beautiful, resilient Native American wife and a son, a new beginning, a new hope. Life in the valley was a dream. Samuel grew, a healthy, happy child, a beautiful blend of his mother's peaceful spirit and his father's quiet strength. They were a family, a unit, a small, fragile beacon of hope in a world of turmoil. Elias taught him how to fish in the river, how to hunt in the forest, how to read the tracks of a deer in the dust. Ayanna taught him the songs of her people, the stories of her ancestors, the secrets of the land. They were happy, but a small part of Elias's heart was filled with a gnawing sense of unease. They were safe here, yes, but they were isolated. They were alone. Their son would grow up with a profound knowledge of the wild, but he would know nothing of the world outside the valley. He would know nothing of other people, of other ways of life. Elias knew he had to do something about it. He had to find a way to connect with the world, a way to bring a small piece of civilization into their lives. He talked to Ayanna about it one evening, his voice a low, worried murmur. "He needs more than just us," he said. "He needs to know about the world. He needs to know about other people. I want him to have a life." Ayanna, her face serene, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding, nodded. "I know," she said. "I have thought the same thing. But it is dangerous, Elias. The world, It is not kind to us. I know, he said, his voice firm, resolute. But we can't hide forever. We can't live in fear. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. I will go. I will go to the nearest town. I will find a way to get what we need. And I will come back, I promise. The decision was a difficult one, but it was a necessary one. They spent the next 2 days preparing, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Ayana packed him a bag with food, water, and a pouch of her mother's healing herbs. She gave him her lucky feather, a small, beautiful token of her love and her faith. On the morning of his departure, Ayana held him close, her body trembling. Be safe, she whispered, her voice filled with a low, desperate plea. Come back to us. We cannot live without you. Elias kissed her, a long, deep kiss that was filled with a lifetime of love and a promise of his return. He kissed Samuel, a small, sweet kiss on his forehead. I will come back, he said, his voice husky with emotion. I will always come back. He rode off into the sunrise, a man on a mission, his heart filled with a quiet, determined resolve. The journey was long and arduous. He had to cross a vast open desert, a lonely, desolate expanse that was a grim reminder of the journey that had brought him here. He had to be careful. He had to be a ghost. He had to be a soldier. Weeks later, he saw the town from a distance. It was small and dusty, a lonely collection of wooden buildings. It was a place filled with the very people he was trying to avoid. But he had no choice. He needed to get what he needed and return to his family. He rode into town under the cover of a late afternoon sun, his body tense, his hand on his pistol. He was just a man. But he was a man who had faced down a mob. He was a man who had survived a war. He was a man who would do whatever it took to keep his family safe. He was not afraid. He was a protector. He was a father. He was a husband. And he would not fail. The town of Redemption was just as he remembered it, a dusty, lonely collection of wooden buildings filled with a mixture of suspicion and quiet kindness. He went to the general store, his heart pounding in his chest. He was a man with a mission. He needed to get what he needed and return to his family. He would not let anything stop him. As he walked into the store, the small bell above the door jingled, a sound that seemed to announce his presence to the world. He saw the store owner, Robert, and for a moment, a wave of profound relief washed over him. He was a friend. He was a good man. He would not betray him. "Elias Thorne," Robert exclaimed, his voice filled with surprise. "We thought you were a ghost. We thought you had disappeared for good." "I've been traveling," Elias said, his voice a low, careful murmur. "I needed to get some supplies." Robert looked at him, his gaze steady and serious. "Heard about the attack on your ranch," he said, his voice low. "Heard you fought 'em off. Good for you, Elias. Some of us, we're not so proud of what happened." Elias simply nodded. He was not here to talk. He was here to get what he needed and leave. But as he was paying for his goods, a familiar figure walked into the store. It was Jebediah Stone. He was a ghost of a man, his face scarred and his body gaunt. He had lost his arm in the fight, and the look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated hatred. He saw Elias and froze. A look of profound shock, followed by a wave of furious rage, crossed his face. "You!" he roared, his voice a gravelly, wounded bellow. "You came back! You damn son of a gun! You came back for me!" Jebediah lunged at him, a small, worn pistol in his hand. Elias, his senses on high alert, was ready. He ducked under the man's wild swing, his body twisting with a practiced grace. He brought his rifle up, a quick, precise blow to the man's hand. The pistol clattered to the ground, a harmless, useless piece of metal. Jebediah, his face contorted with rage, looked at him, a look of profound, defeated rage in his eyes. He had been a mob leader, a vengeful killer, but now he was just a broken, defeated old man. "You took everything from me," he screamed, his voice filled with a terrible, wounded fury. "You took my arm! You took my men! You took my honor!" "You took it from yourself, Jebediah," Elias said, his voice low and firm. "You brought this on yourself. You chose to be filled with hate. You chose to be a fool." The words were a cold, hard truth, a truth that hit Jebediah with a force that was more powerful than any blow. He stood there, his body shaking, his mind a whirlwind of pain and confusion. The man who had been a symbol of hatred, a symbol of vengeance, was now just a broken, pathetic figure. The men in the store, who had been watching in silent awe, now looked at Jebediah with a new kind of pity, a new kind of contempt. The man who had been their leader was now just a loser. He was defeated. Elias, his mission complete, simply picked up his supplies and walked out of the store. He did not look back. He had faced his past, and he had won. He was a new man, a man with a future, a man with a purpose. He rode out of town, his heart filled with a new sense of peace. He had not only survived, he had triumphed. He had faced the worst of the world, and he had come out on the other side. He had found his home, he had found his family, and in the end he had found himself. The journey back was long, but it was a journey of joy. He was no longer a man on the run. He was a man with a destination. He was a man with a family waiting for him. He was a man with a future. He rode toward the sunset, his heart filled with a love that was as vast as the endless sky above him. Elias rode into the valley under the cover of a late afternoon sun, his heart pounding with a wild, joyous rhythm. The sight of the cave, their home, was a beautiful, welcome sight. He was home. He was back. He dismounted and ran to the cave, his boots making a soft, rhythmic thud against the earth. Ayana, hearing the sound of his return, ran out to meet him, her face a mask of weary relief. She ran into his arms, her body trembling, her face buried in his chest. "You came back," she whispered, her voice filled with a terrible, joyous relief. "You came back to us." Elias held her close, his body shaking with a profound sense of gratitude. "I told you I would," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will always come back to you." He looked at her, and in her eyes he saw a lifetime of love and a future of endless possibilities. He had come home to a life he had never thought possible. A life filled with love, a life filled with hope, a life filled with a beautiful, resilient Native American wife and a son, a new beginning, a new hope. They walked into the cave, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with a sense of profound peace. They were a family. They were a unit. They were a small, fragile beacon of hope in a world of turmoil. The journey was not over. The world was still a dangerous place. But they were no longer afraid. They had faced their past and they had won. They had faced a mob, a killer, a desert, and a society filled with hatred. They had faced it all, and they had survived. They had found their home. They had found their family. They had found each other. The lonely rancher had returned home, not to a dusty, broken cabin, but to a life he had never thought possible. A life filled with love. A life filled with hope. A life filled with a beautiful, unexpected reward. A beautiful native wife, and a family they had built together. The journey was a long and arduous one, but in the end, it was a journey that had led him to a place of peace, a place of love, a place of belonging. And in that moment he was no longer a lonely man. He was a man with a purpose, a man with a home, and a man with a future that was as beautiful and endless as the vast open sky above them.